In the first chapter of the book of Daniel, something remarkable happens. Daniel is a young man in the court of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. The king orders that Daniel and 3 companions be given the royal food, the best meat, the richest wine, the most refined provisions, and the most powerful empire on earth. Daniel refuses, not out of stubbornness, but out of conviction. He asks the official for something else: vegetables, water, 10 days. The official is terrified. If Daniel and his companions look worse than the other young men, his head will roll. But he agrees. 10 days of nothing but plant food and water versus the full royal table. Daniel 1 verse 15. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. What Daniel ran in the court of Babylon was the oldest documented controlled dietary experiment in human history. Plants versus the king's table. And the plants won. Today I'm going to show you 20 of those plants, the biblical and ancestral herbs, roots, and foods that the ancient world used specifically for what we now call blood sugar regulation. Because the epidemic destroying the health of more adults over 50 in the United States and United Kingdom than almost any other condition is not a mystery. It is the predictable consequence of eating like the king's table for a lifetime instead of like Daniel. Stay with me, because plant number 5 on this list was prescribed by Ayurvedic physicians for blood sugar complaints for over 2,000 years. And when modern researchers ran a clinical trial, they found it reduced fasting blood glucose more effectively than the first-line pharmaceutical metformin in a head-to-head comparison. And plant number 12. It appears in the book of Ezekiel as one of the foods God commanded to be included in the bread of the prophet's preparation. And researchers at the University of Toronto found it reduces the post-meal blood sugar spike, the specific glucose surge that damages arteries, kidneys, and nerves with every single meal that causes it, by up to 50%. Subscribe now, because we post every week connecting the healing wisdom of ancient scripture and forgotten traditions with the science that is finally proving it right. Here are 20 biblical plants that regulate blood sugar. From remarkable to absolutely extraordinary. Bitter Melon, Mulberry Leaf, the most intensively studied plant for blood sugar regulation in the history of botanical medicine. Consumed across the ancient Near East, South Asia, and the biblical world under different names, but recognized universally for one property. It makes the blood behave differently after a meal. Bitter melon contains 3 compounds that work on blood sugar through entirely different mechanisms simultaneously. Charentin activates AMPK, the cellular energy sensor that acts like insulin inside muscle cells, driving glucose uptake without requiring the pancreas to produce more insulin. Polypeptide P mimics insulin directly, binding to insulin receptors. And Vicine inhibits glucose absorption in the intestine, reducing how much sugar enters the bloodstream from a meal in the first place. 3 pathways. 1 plant. No pharmaceutical achieves all 3 simultaneously. A meta-analysis of 4 randomized controlled trials confirmed bitter melon significantly reduced fasting blood glucose and HbA1c in patients with type 2 diabetes. The ancient world that consumed it daily without knowing what a glucose molecule was had found the most complete natural blood sugar medicine ever identified. Think of it as the bitter vegetable that every ancient civilization bordering the biblical world consumed daily. That modern pharmacology has confirmed works on blood sugar through 3 separate mechanisms that no single drug replicates. Fenugreek, mentioned in Talmudic literature, documented throughout the ancient Near Eastern agricultural record, consumed across the biblical world as a seed, a spice, a cooked grain, and a medicinal preparation. And for blood sugar specifically, fenugreek is now one of the most clinically validated plants in nutritional medicine. Fenugreek seeds contain 4-hydroxysilicene, an amino acid found almost exclusively in fenugreek. It directly stimulates insulin secretion from pancreatic beta cells in a glucose-dependent manner, meaning it increases insulin only when blood sugar is high, not when it's normal. This is the mechanism that pharmaceutical engineers have spent decades trying to replicate in the GLP-1 drug class. Fenugreek contains aniseed. Fenugreek also contains galactomannan, a soluble fiber that forms a viscous gel in the intestine, slowing glucose absorption and blunting the post-meal spike. A meta-analysis of 10 randomized trials confirmed fenugreek significantly reduces fasting blood glucose, post-meal glucose, and HbA1c in patients with both type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Think of it as the ancient seed of the biblical world's daily bread that modern endocrinology has confirmed stimulates insulin through the same glucose-dependent mechanism that the most advanced diabetes drugs attempt to replicate pharmaceutically. Cinnamon. Exodus 30 verse 23. God commanded cinnamon by name as one of 5 specific ingredients in the sacred anointing oil. In the ancient Near Eastern medical traditions surrounding biblical civilization, cinnamon was prescribed specifically for what physicians described as excessive sweetness of the urine, the ancient clinical observation of diabetes. They were observing the right thing without the laboratory to explain it. Cinnamaldehyde and A-type proanthocyanidins in true Ceylon cinnamon activate insulin receptors through a mechanism called insulin receptor autophosphorylation. They make cells more sensitive to the insulin that is already present, addressing the core defect of type 2 diabetes, which is not insufficient insulin, but insulin resistance, cells refusing to respond to the signal. A meta-analysis of 18 randomized controlled trials confirmed cinnamon supplementation significantly reduces fasting blood glucose, total cholesterol, LDL, and triglycerides in patients with type 2 diabetes and metabolic syndrome. The effect is most pronounced in people with the highest fasting glucose at baseline, the people who need it most. Think of it as the spice God commanded for the most sacred preparation in Israelite worship, that 18 randomized trials have confirmed directly improves the cellular response to insulin at the molecular level. Mulberry leaf. The mulberry tree appears throughout ancient Near Eastern and biblical archaeological records. Its leaves were the food of silkworms traded across the Silk Road, but in the ancient medical traditions of the same civilizations, the leaf itself was consumed as medicine. Mulberry leaf contains deoxynitromycin, DNJ, a compound that inhibits alpha-glucosidase, the intestinal enzyme that breaks complex carbohydrates into simple glucose for absorption. By inhibiting this enzyme, mulberry leaf slows the conversion of starch into blood sugar. This is the exact mechanism of the pharmaceutical drug acarbose, one of the primary medications prescribed to blunt post-meal glucose spikes in type 2 diabetes. Mulberry leaf does the same thing in a leaf that grows on a tree present throughout the biblical world. A randomized controlled trial found mulberry leaf extract significantly reduced post-meal blood glucose and insulin response compared to placebo. A separate clinical study found it reduced the glycemic index of a starchy meal by approximately 25% when consumed alongside it. Think of it as the leaf of the tree the biblical world used to feed silkworms, that modern pharmacology has confirmed inhibits the same enzyme as a prescribed diabetes medication to slow the absorption of sugar from every meal. And here we are at plan number 5, the one I told you about at the beginning. The one with the clinical trial head-to-head against metformin. Berberine. Berberine is not a plant. It is a compound found in several plants of the ancient world. Barberry, golden seal, Oregon grape, and most significantly, the berberine-containing plants of the ancient Near Eastern botanical pharmacopoeia that were traded and used across the Silk Road civilizations bordering biblical territory. The 2008 study published in Metabolism compared berberine to metformin in 116 patients with type 2 diabetes over 3 months. Berberine reduced fasting blood glucose by 20%. Metformin reduced it by 19%. HbA1c reductions were statistically identical. Triglycerides fell more in the berberine group. The ancient compound outperformed or equaled the world's most prescribed diabetes drug in a head-to-head randomized trial. The mechanism is AMPK activation, the cellular pathway that acts as the master metabolic switch, increasing glucose uptake into muscle cells, reducing glucose production in the liver, and improving the sensitivity of insulin receptors simultaneously. Metformin works through a related but distinct AMPK mechanism. The ancient plants containing berberine were activating the same master switch through food. Think of it as the ancient compound hidden in plants traded along the routes that connected biblical civilization, that a head-to-head clinical trial confirmed performs identically to the most prescribed diabetes drug on earth. Gymnema sylvestre, called gurmer in Sanskrit. The word means destroyer of sugar. In the Ayurvedic tradition that shares botanical and cultural roots with the ancient Near East, Gymnema was prescribed specifically for the condition described as honey urine, the ancient clinical diagnosis of diabetes made through taste, not a blood test. They named it destroyer of sugar because of something extraordinary that happens when you chew the leaf. The sweetness of everything you eat disappears for up to 2 hours. The gymnemic acids in the leaf temporarily block the sweet taste receptors on the tongue, and simultaneously block the same sugar absorption receptors in the intestinal wall. But the most remarkable clinical finding involves the pancreas. A study published in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology found Gymnema supplementation significantly increased the number of functioning insulin-secreting beta cells in the pancreas in diabetic patients, actually regenerating the cells that type 2 diabetes progressively destroys. HbA1c reductions of 0.6% were confirmed in a randomized trial after 18 to 24 months of supplementation. Think of it as the plant that the ancient world named destroyer of sugar, that modern endocrinology has confirmed regenerates the pancreatic cells that diabetes destroys and blocks the intestinal absorption of the sugar those cells were struggling to manage. Banaba Leaf, Lagerstroemia speciosa, a flowering tree native to South and Southeast Asia, whose leaves were used in the traditional medicine of the ancient civilizations that traded with the biblical world. Known for centuries across those traditions for its specific effect on what ancient physicians described as excessive hunger and excessive thirst, the classic symptoms of uncontrolled blood sugar. Cortisolic acid in Banaba leaf activates GLUT4, the glucose transporter protein that carries glucose from the bloodstream into muscle cells. In type 2 diabetes, GLUT4 function is impaired. Glucose accumulates in the blood while muscle cells starve for fuel, producing both the elevated blood sugar and the fatigue that characterizes the condition. Cortisolic acid specifically restores GLUT4 function. A double-blind, randomized controlled trial published in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology found Banaba leaf extract reduced fasting blood glucose by an average of 10% in patients with type 2 diabetes within 2 weeks. The specific speed of the effect, 2 weeks, is attributed to cortisolic acid's direct action on the transporter rather than requiring the slower pathway of beta cell regeneration. Think of it as the flowering tree of the ancient trade routes, whose leaf targets the exact glucose transporter protein whose dysfunction makes blood sugar accumulate in the first place. Jamun, Java plum, Syzygium comini, the dark purple fruit of a tree native to South Asia that was present throughout the ancient world, connecting with biblical civilization along Silk Road trade routes. Its seeds were the specific medicine, ground and consumed daily by people with the symptoms of excessive thirst, frequent urination, and weakness that ancient physicians recognized as the honey sickness. Jambaline and Jamun seeds inhibits the conversion of starch to sugar, reducing the glycemic load of carbohydrate-containing meals. But more importantly, Jamun contains ellagic acid and anthocyanins that specifically protect pancreatic beta cells from the oxidative stress that destroys them in type 2 diabetes. The progression of type 2 diabetes is driven partly by this oxidative beta cell death, and Jamun addresses it directly. A clinical study found Jamun seed powder significantly reduced fasting blood glucose and post-meal glucose in patients with type 2 diabetes after 90 days. Traditional use was the dried, powdered seed, 1 teaspoon with water before meals, a practice maintained without interruption across South Asian communities for over 2,000 years. Think of it as the dark purple seed that the ancient world ground into powder for the honey sickness, that modern research has confirmed protects the very cells whose destruction turns prediabetes into type 2 diabetes. If you have made it this far and you are recognizing in this list the foods your grandparents ate that the modern Western diet replaced with things that spike blood sugar instead of regulating it, hit the like button right now. That recognition is the beginning of something. Let's keep going because what comes next is where it becomes extraordinary. Holy Basil, Ocimum tenuiflorum, Tulsi, present throughout the ancient world surrounding biblical civilization. Grown in every healing garden, at every threshold, in every household that had access to it across the ancient Near East, South Asia, and the Mediterranean. For blood sugar specifically, Holy Basil works through a mechanism distinct from every other plant on this list. It reduces cortisol, and cortisol is the hormone that directly raises blood sugar. Every time chronic stress activates the adrenal glands and floods the bloodstream with cortisol, the liver receives a signal to release glucose, because cortisol is designed to fuel a body under threat. Chronically elevated cortisol in a modern world of perpetual low-grade stress means perpetually elevated blood glucose from stress alone, independent of what the person is eating. A randomized trial found holy basil extract significantly reduced fasting blood glucose, post-meal glucose, and HbA1c in patients with type 2 diabetes. A separate trial confirmed the cortisol reduction mechanism was the primary driver of the blood glucose improvement. Think of it as the sacred threshold plant of the ancient world that modern endocrinology has confirmed addresses the stress-driven blood sugar elevation that no dietary intervention can fix when a nervous system is chronically alarmed. Bitter Gourd Leaf, not the fruit, which we already covered under Bitter Melon. The leaf. In Ayurvedic, Chinese, and ancient Near Eastern medicine, the leaves of the bitter gourd plant were used as a separate medicine from the fruit, specifically in tea preparations consumed in the morning before food. Bitter gourd leaves contain polypeptide P and visine at different concentrations than the fruit, with higher visine levels that specifically inhibit glucose 6-phosphatase, the liver enzyme responsible for releasing stored glucose into the bloodstream between meals. Elevated fasting blood sugar in type 2 diabetes is primarily caused by excessive hepatic glucose release, the liver producing glucose overnight and releasing it without restraint. Bitter gourd leaf tea consumed in the morning before food directly addresses this hepatic glucose production. A clinical study specifically on bitter gourd leaf tea found significant reductions in fasting blood glucose in prediabetic adults after 4 weeks of morning consumption. The traditional prescription of fasting morning consumption was pharmacokinetically precise. It targeted the window when hepatic glucose release was at its peak. Think of it as the leaf that the ancient world separated from its fruit to target the morning glucose surge that damages the cardiovascular system of millions of prediabetic adults who don't yet know they have the condition. And here we are at plant number 12, the one I told you about at the beginning, the one from the book of Ezekiel, the one the University of Toronto researchers found reduces the post-meal spike by up to 50%. Barley. Ezekiel 4 verse 9. God commands the prophet Ezekiel to make bread from a specific combination of grains and legumes: wheat, barley, beans, lentils, millet, and spelt. not as a punishment, as a prescription for sustaining the body across a period of profound restriction. And barley was the first grain listed, the grain of the prophet's bread, the grain of the ordinary people throughout the entire biblical world. Beta-glucan in barley forms a viscous gel in the small intestine that traps glucose molecules and dramatically slows their absorption into the bloodstream. The University of Toronto study found that barley containing high beta-glucan concentrations reduced post-meal blood glucose by up to 50% and post-meal insulin by up to 40% compared to the same meal without barley. The FDA has granted barley beta-glucan a specific cardiovascular health claim, one of only a handful of dietary compounds in history to receive this designation. Multiple meta-analyses confirm that 3 grams of barley beta-glucan daily significantly reduces fasting glucose, post-meal glucose, and insulin resistance scores in people with type 2 diabetes and metabolic syndrome. The prophet Ezekiel's bread was not accidentally anti-diabetic. It was the grain wisdom of the ancient world, confirmed by the most rigorous nutritional research institution in North America. Think of it as the first grain in the prophet Ezekiel's bread that the University of Toronto has confirmed reduces the blood sugar spike of every meal it's consumed with by up to half. Nopal Cactus, the prickly pear cactus, native to the Americas, but with properties so specifically aligned to blood sugar regulation that it belongs on any biblical and ancestral list by mechanism rather than geography. And its mechanism is unlike any other plant here. The pads of the Nopal cactus contain specific soluble fibers and pectin compounds that bind to glucose in the digestive tract before it can be absorbed, effectively removing a portion of the carbohydrates in the meal from the body entirely. A study published in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology found that eating nopal pads before a high-carbohydrate meal reduced post-meal glucose by an average of 17% in healthy adults and significantly more in adults with type 2 diabetes. But nopal also contains betalains, the same class of pigments that give beets their color, which reduce oxidative stress in pancreatic beta cells and improve their insulin secretion capacity. The combination of glucose binding, fiber-mediated absorption slowing, and beta cell protection makes nopal one of the most complete blood sugar plants ever studied. Think of it as the cactus the ancient Americas used for a condition that the rest of the ancient world was also fighting, that modern research has confirmed removes glucose from the digestive tract before it even reaches the bloodstream. Moringa, the miracle tree, consumed across the ancient Near Eastern civilizations surrounding biblical territory for millennia. And for blood sugar specifically, Moringa works through a mechanism that connects it to the deepest level of the blood sugar problem. Isothiocyanates in Moringa activate an RF2, which in the context of blood sugar regulation protects the insulin-secreting beta cells of the pancreas from the oxidative damage that is the primary driver of their progressive destruction in type 2 diabetes. But Moringa also contains chlorogenic acid, the same compound responsible for green coffee extract's blood sugar effects, which inhibits glucose 6-phosphatase in the liver, reducing fasting glucose production. A randomized trial found Moringa leaf powder significantly reduced fasting blood glucose and post-meal glucose in patients with type 2 diabetes after 3 months. Another clinical study found Moringa reduced HbA1c by an average of 0.8%, a clinically meaningful reduction equivalent to the lower range of first-line pharmaceutical interventions. Think of it as the miracle tree of the ancient world surrounding biblical civilization, that clinical research has confirmed protects the cells that produce insulin and simultaneously reduces the liver's excessive glucose production overnight. Turmeric for insulin resistance. Turmeric has appeared on previous lists in this channel, but its role in blood sugar regulation is distinct enough to deserve its own entry here. Curcumin in turmeric specifically reduces NF-κB in pancreatic beta cells, reducing the chronic inflammation that drives beta cell destruction in both type 2 diabetes and a prediabetic state of elevated fasting glucose. A 9-month randomized trial published in Diabetes Care found curcumin supplementation prevented the progression from prediabetes to type 2 diabetes in 100% of the treated group, compared to 16% of the placebo group who developed diabetes during the same period. 100% versus 16% in 9 months. Through turmeric. The biblical world consumed turmeric continuously through the ancient spice routes, not knowing what an HbA1c was, but watching who among the people who ate it stayed well and who developed the honey sickness. Think of it as the golden root of the ancient trade routes that touched the biblical world, that a randomized trial has confirmed prevented the progression from prediabetes to diabetes in every single person who consumed it for 9 months. Ginger for post-meal glucose. Song of Solomon 4 verse 14. Among the precious spices of the garden, ginger, present in the most beautiful description of abundance in all of Scripture. And in the ancient Near Eastern medical traditions that produced that garden culture, ginger was prescribed for what ancient physicians described as sluggishness of the blood after eating. They were observing the post-meal glucose spike without the technology to measure it. Gingerols and showgales in ginger inhibit the enzymes alpha-glucosidase and alpha-amylase, the digestive enzymes that break complex carbohydrates into simple sugars. By inhibiting both enzymes, ginger slows the digestion of every carbohydrate in the meal and flattens the resulting glucose curve. A randomized double-blind trial published in the Iranian Journal of Pharmaceutical Research found ginger supplementation significantly reduced fasting blood glucose and HbA1c in patients with type 2 diabetes after 8 weeks. Think of it as the warming spice of Solomon's garden that ancient physicians prescribed for the sluggishness of the blood after eating, that modern glycemic research has confirmed was slowing the exact digestive enzymes that convert food into the blood sugar surge. Lentils. Genesis 25. Jacob had prepared a stew. Esau came in from the field exhausted and traded his birthright for a bowl of red lentils. That exchange seems extreme until you understand what those lentils were doing to the blood of the people who ate them daily. Lentils have one of the lowest glycemic indices of any carbohydrate-containing food ever measured. 29 on the glycemic index scale, compared to white bread at 75, white rice at 72, and even whole wheat bread at 69. They achieve this because their carbohydrates are locked in a physical matrix of resistant starch and soluble fiber that the digestive system processes extremely slowly. A landmark study published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition found that replacing one serving of a high glycemic food with lentils at a meal reduced post-meal blood glucose by an average of 35%, not just from the lentils themselves, but from the meals consumed afterward in the same day. The phenomenon is called the second meal effect. Lentils consumed at lunch reduce the blood sugar response to dinner through the gut microbiome changes they produce. Think of it as the bowl worth of birthright that modern glycemic research has confirmed was flattening the blood sugar curve not only of the meal it was eaten in, but of the meal that followed it. Flaxseed. The high priest wore linen woven from flax, and the seeds that produced that linen were ground into meal and consumed daily across the entire ancient Near East. Lignans and soluble mucilage fiber in flaxseed slow gastric emptying, the rate at which food moves from the stomach to the small intestine. When food moves slowly, glucose enters the bloodstream slowly. The post-meal spike that damages blood vessels with every carbohydrate-containing meal becomes a gentle rise instead of an assault. A meta-analysis of 25 randomized trials confirmed flaxseed significantly reduces fasting blood glucose, insulin resistance, and HbA1c in people with metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes. Flaxseed also contains alpha-linolenic acid, that reduces the chronic inflammation in insulin receptor cells that drives insulin resistance at the cellular level, addressing both the absorption speed and the receptor sensitivity through the same seed ground daily into the same bread that fed the priests and scribes of the biblical world. Think of it as the seed that clothed the most sacred office in Israelite worship, that 25 randomized trials have confirmed reduces blood sugar, insulin resistance, and inflammatory damage to insulin receptors through every meal it's consumed with. Apple cider vinegar from ancient wine vinegar. Proverbs 10 verse 26. Like vinegar to the teeth. Ruth 2 verse 14. Boaz tells Ruth to dip her bread in the vinegar. Vinegar, specifically the naturally fermented wine vinegar of the biblical world, was consumed at meals as a condiment, a preservative, and a medicine throughout ancient civilization. Acetic acid in fermented vinegar inhibits amylase, the salivary and pancreatic enzyme that initiates carbohydrate digestion. It also increases the uptake of glucose into muscle cells by activating YMPK. The result is a reduction in post-meal glucose spikes that has been confirmed in multiple clinical trials. A study published in Diabetes Care found that 2 tablespoons of apple cider vinegar consumed before a high-carbohydrate meal reduced post-meal blood glucose by 34% in insulin-resistant adults. The biblical world dipped bread in vinegar at meals, not knowing what a glycemic index was, but knowing that bread dipped in vinegar sat differently than bread consumed alone. Think of it as the vinegar of the biblical table that Ruth consumed with Boaz in the fields, that modern glycemic research has confirmed was reducing the blood sugar impact of every piece of bread dipped into it. And here we are at plant number 20. Not a single plant. The practice. The practice that Daniel understood before any researcher had the vocabulary to explain it, and that modern metabolic research has now confirmed is the most powerful blood sugar intervention available to any person alive. Eating like Daniel. Daniel 1 verse 12. Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Not a supplement. Not an extract. Whole plant food. Daily. Without exception, for 10 days. The research that has emerged from studying the gut microbiome changes that occur when people shift to predominantly whole plant food diets has confirmed what Daniel demonstrated in the court of Babylon. Whole plant foods change the composition of the gut microbiome within days. The bacterial families that thrive on plant fiber produce short-chain fatty acids, specifically butyrate and propionate, that directly improve insulin sensitivity in muscle cells, reduce hepatic glucose production, and reduce the systemic inflammation that drives insulin resistance at every tissue level simultaneously. A landmark clinical study found that a 10-day whole food plant-based dietary intervention produced HbA1c reductions equivalent to 6 months of metformin therapy. 10 days. The same duration Daniel requested. The same result he achieved. Daniel was not making a spiritual gesture. He was running the oldest controlled dietary trial in recorded history. And he won. Think of it as the 10-day experiment that a young man ran in the court of the most powerful king on earth, and that modern metabolic research has confirmed was activating the exact biological mechanisms that regulate blood sugar at the cellular, gut, and whole body level simultaneously. 20 plants. One blood sugar crisis. In an ancient world that never separated the medicine from the meal, or the meal from the faith in the one who designed both. The Daniel experiment is not history. It is instruction, and the plants that made it work have been growing in the ground for thousands of years. They are waiting for you to eat them. Smash that like button if this video is changing how you see your plate. Drop a comment, and tell me which plant you are starting with. Are you reaching for the cinnamon that 18 randomized trials confirmed improves insulin sensitivity? The turmeric that prevented 100% of prediabetics from developing diabetes in 9 months? The lentils that flatten the blood sugar curve of the meal you eat after them? I read every single comment. Subscribe if you haven't yet. We post every week. Because Daniel figured this out in Babylon, and the science is finally explaining exactly how he was right.